And welcome to WizeUp. My name is Paul Arthur, and we're going to tackle the sometimes, maybe almost always, divisive topic of climate change. Many people see it as a climate emergency, perhaps even more and more these days as something that is, end times, the end of our planet, that sort of thing. Others say, hey, you know what? No worries. Hakuna Matata, right? It's nothing to lose sleep over. So my question is it okay to ask questions about the whole thing? Unfortunately, these days, it seems more and more when you ask questions, then you become a climate change denier, and that's not usually a complimentary term. Okay, so where do we go from here? Our guest today joins us from the Ottawa area, Tom Harris. He's the executive director of the not-for-profit International Climate Science Coalition. Their website is icsc-canada.com, and you can check out some of the articles there. Tom, good to have you with us.
Yeah, nice to be on.
Well, we have lots to talk about today. You recently wrote a thought-provoking article for the Toronto Sun, and it was labeled Conservative Leaders Must Stop Promoting Climate Scare. And I kind of went, did you get that wrong? Usually when we talk about that, you're referring to Liberal or NDP or Green Party politicians, not conservative leaders. So, maybe unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, sure. 2 years ago, we had a booth at the Strong and Free Networking Conference here in Ottawa, which is a conservative conference. And we had a big poster up saying there's no climate emergency and other things like that. And we had grassroots conservatives come up to us, hundreds of them, say, yes, you're right. We totally agree. But the problem is our leaders won't say that. And so just down the hall, there was a session being held that I went to, which was a conservative approach to stopping climate change. And, I was all ready to ask them a question, but they canceled the question period. I think they saw me in the front row. And so I talked to the moderator afterwards, and I said, do you think there's a climate emergency? And he said, no. I said, so why do you have a session on stopping this so-called emergency if you don't think it exists? He said, oh, we fought that battle and we lost it. I said, you never fought that battle, And if you think about it, what happened is the very best speech in the House of Commons ever given on this topic from a climate realist point of view was Preston Manning back in 1997 when they were debating the Kyoto Protocol. But sadly, he changed sides. Bob Mills, who was the opposition environment critic under Stephen Harper when Stephen was the leader of the opposition, he actually was on our side as well. And in fact, it's interesting that I worked for him as a legislative assistant, and I would write speeches for Bob and write articles with him and stuff for, talking about what's really happening in the climate. But he changed sides as well. And so now you have this huge disconnect between grassroots conservatives who understand there's no climate emergency. 1.2 degree rise in 143 years since 1880 is, you wouldn't even feel it in your lifetime. All the computer models, that's the only basis of the climate scare. And we can talk about that in a minute. But so we have this disconnect. You have the grassroots who want them to say there's no climate emergency. Stop wasting all this money. In the case of the Liberals, $120 billion since they came in trying to stop climate change or adapt to some fictitious forecast of what they think it's going to do. But the leaders won't do it. And, it's funny because when Pierre Poilievre was running to be head of the Conservative Party, I spoke to his campaign manager, and he wouldn't tell me directly that Pierre doesn't believe in the scare. But based on the way he was talking, I kind of came to that conclusion that Pierre doesn't believe there's a climate emergency. And, so the bottom line is, why are they doing it? I mean, what's the point? Why don't they just stand up and tell the truth? Hold up books like this, which is Climate Change Reconsidered. Okay. There's about 1,000 pages here, and people can check it out on the web. It's at climatechangereconsidered.org. This is one of only several volumes. As I say, there's thousands of references in here from scientists literally all over the world who say there's no climate emergency. And as I say, the easiest thing to do is to point to what's happened to the so-called global temperature. 1.2 degrees since 1880. I mean, you wouldn't even feel that. Yeah, you wouldn't even feel that.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of my concern here as well. Is do we believe whatever, we're told essentially? And, we're a little bit like sheep that way. We tend to be that way. Let's do some research here. Let's ask some hard questions. And well, that's part of the problem here too. We can maybe come back to that. When you ask questions, you get, put down, you get there's name calling, et cetera. You get canceled,
or death
maybe you get fired. There's some serious issues here. So you need to follow the money trail, et cetera. There's a lot to this. But getting back to, again, you're saying, conservatives, the leaders, in this case, actually promoting climate scare. You suggest that referring to carbon dioxide, CO2, as carbon is actually a mistake. So what's the problem with simply calling it carbon? Why is that an issue?
Yeah, well, the molecule, of course, is carbon dioxide, CO2. And carbon is, pure carbon is like graphite or soot, or quite frankly, diamonds. That's pure carbon. And that is pollution. Soot is really pollution, carbon. But carbon makes more compounds than any other substance. I mean, our bodies, birds and bees and oil, all these things are all made with carbon in them. To show you how silly it is to call carbon dioxide carbon, let's pretend there was an hydropower activist, and they wanted water to be somehow demonized. So they just drop the oxygen, off of H2O, and they start calling it hydrogen. And people would laugh. They say it's not hydrogen, it's hydrogen, dihydrogen oxide, if you want to say it chemically. So when you take the O2 off of carbon, you give the impression in people's minds of lamp black or something dirty. Whereas carbon dioxide is plant food, of course. It's invisible, it's odorless, it's benign. And we have to also realize that carbon dioxide has been much, much higher in Earth's history. If we go back, 440 million years ago, we had carbon dioxide levels 1,000% of today. Now, environmentalists get all excited. They say, oh, geez, CO2 has gone up 50% since the late 1800s. And that's true. But we're still at one of the lowest levels of carbon dioxide in Earth's history. CO2 has been going down for millions of years. And, one of our board members, Dr. Patrick Moore, who was a founder of Greenpeace, he actually now is going around the country showing this gradual decline in CO2 with a slight uptick at the end where we've had a 50% rise. He shows this gradual decline over millions of years. And the point he makes is that during the last glacial period, CO2 got down to about 180 parts per million, which is very low. I mean, at 150 parts per million, plants start to die. So we were pretty close to a dangerously low level. And Patrick maintains that if we hadn't come along and started to pump CO2 into the air by burning fossil fuels and making cement and things like that, that we were headed down to the end of life on Earth. So he says we should celebrate the rise in CO2, and we see massive increase in crop yield. We see a greening of the earth, the shrinking of deserts. CO2 is a very good substance. So when they call it carbon pollution, doubly bad, carbon, it's not carbon, and it's also not pollution, it's plant food. And you see that all through the language. And that's the first mistake that conservatives make, is they use the language of their enemies. In martial arts, they're always telling you, don't fight your enemies or your opponent's battle, fight your own, use your own style. And so you just don't use the language of the opponents. They should stop calling it, for example, even a carbon tax. And they should never call it a tax on pollution, that's for sure.
Very interesting. Okay. Well, words do make a difference. They matter.
Oh, yeah.
You believe that conservatives need to stop promoting the replacement of coal with clean natural gas. Now, you're saying this implies that coal-fired power plants aren't necessarily unclean. So talk to us a bit about coal. Is it bad?
No, coal, of course, is a natural substance, and it's either dirty or not dirty based on how you burn it. We have very clean burning coal technologies which we can use, and it's interesting, in Ontario, Dalton McGuinty, when he was premier back around the year 2000, they contracted an engineering firm to look at how would they clean up Ontario's air. And the conclusion was, don't close your coal stations, just bring in the latest clean technology, for removing particulates and real pollution. But McGuinty, of course, wanted to lead the world in climate change. So he had a press conference in which he piled up a lot of coal on a table, which of course looks very dirty. And he said, we're going to get rid of coal. And he did. And as a consequence, depending on the month, because the prices vary, the price of electricity in Ontario has gone up by double, 100% rise, even 200% rise, because we got rid of the quarter of our electricity that was coming from coal. Now, that's the problem Alberta faces now, because you use a lot of coal, and the thrust is to get rid of coal. No, you shouldn't get rid of coal. Coal has a lot of benefits that natural gas doesn't have. First of all, it's very cheap. Okay, it's very inexpensive to grind this up, pulverize it, burn it to make steam, to make electricity. The other thing is we have incredible supplies of coal. And the third thing, and this is something people forget, the beauty of coal, and the same thing applies to nuclear actually, is that you pile up your resource on the power station, actually on the property. So you have a year's supply or more of power that you can provide. You don't have to have a pipeline always working coming into your coal station. You just have a big pile of coal. Same thing with uranium. Now, natural gas is a special fuel. Natural gas can be used for all sorts of things besides burning it to make electricity. We use it to make plastics. We use it for home heating. We use it for all sorts of things. It's a wonderful fuel. So replacing coal with natural gas, you could call it a reverse Midas touch. In other words, it's turning gold into lead. You're actually, instead of using natural gas, instead of using coal, you're using natural gas, which is your gold. Like, why would you do that? Save natural gas for special uses.
I think people are arguing that the coal, I guess, I mean, you're saying we have technology to make it burn clean.
Yeah.
Does it emit like huge amounts of CO2? And is that bad for the climate, bad for environment? What's your argument?
Yeah, that's the point. It's not that hard to remove real pollution, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, particulates, things like that. You can remove that from coal relatively inexpensively. But they want to classify carbon dioxide as a pollutant, and it's interesting because when Paul Martin was prime minister, they decided to add carbon dioxide to the list of toxic substances under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And it was quite funny because they had things like lead and PCB and mercury, and then they had carbon dioxide on this list of toxic substances. And in the brackets afterwards, it said, this is not a toxic substance. And you say, well, then what's it doing on the list of toxic substances? And of course, the reason they put it there was because they wanted to control it under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And Stephen Harper railed about this. He said, that's pretty ridiculous. You're putting it on the list of toxic substances with a note saying it's not a toxic substance. But the problem was when Harper became prime minister, he left it there. He didn't take it off the list. So the big problem with coal, if you're concerned about carbon dioxide, is that you're right. Carbon dioxide, there's a lot more of it coming from coal than natural gas. So if you're treating it as a pollutant, then yes, they would have to switch off coal. And in fact, it's interesting, one of the solutions, and I put it in brackets, it's not a real solution because there's no climate crisis, but one of the solutions that Pierre Poilievre is pushing is capturing carbon dioxide from power plants, compressing it, pumping it long distances, and then putting it underground in what they call carbon sequestration. Now, this will massively increase the price of coal. In fact, Bob Murray, who was the head of Murray Energy before he passed away in the United States, it's a large independent coal company. He was one of the few energy people who would speak out and say the truth. He said, carbon sequestration, he said, that's code for no coal. Okay, so if you're going to have carbon sequestration, it becomes way too expensive to have
drives
coal.
The price up.
Oh, totally, yeah. So that's the problem with the Conservative plan.
Well, speaking of price, this is one thing that does bother me a lot, especially when I look around the world and see how many needs we have in developing countries for food, clean water, medicine, all these kinds of things.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a rough idea of how much money the various, superpower countries around the world are spending to fight climate change? And from what I'm seeing so far, I don't know that it's making much difference as far as controlling the overall global temperatures, these kinds of things. And then I know earlier today you sent me a brief email with some stats, and I'm going, wow.
It's crazy.
Do you want to just share how much money is being spent, and who's documenting this? This is not coming from, climate change, people. This is coming from the people who are promoting, well, let's fight climate change. Here's their stats on what we're spending on it, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a group out of San Francisco called the Climate Policy Initiative, and people can check them out, climatepolicyinitiative.org. And they do annual, what they call finance tracking, climate finance tracking, where they try to find out how much money is being spent across the world in adaptation, which is actually a good use of money, how much is being spent trying to stop climate change by reducing greenhouse gases. And here's the latest number. From 2021, 2022, which was their year, it went from part of the year to part of the year. They calculated 1.3 trillion US dollars. Okay, 1.3 trillion.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, I think that's a low ball because they haven't been able to track, I'm sure, many of the possible, sources of where money's being spent in all sorts of places. But 1.3 trillion, let's say over the last 10 years, I mean, that might average out to about 0.8 trillion, 800 billion with a B. So we're talking about something like $10 trillion over the last decade, 10 trillion. Now, I mean, and the sad thing is, Africa, for example, which, is always in need, they have lots of coal. But we are not giving them loans to build coal stations to pull their people out of poverty because we're telling them they have to run their countries on wind and solar power, which we can't afford, So the whole climate issue is actually holding down the poor. Now, countries like India, they don't rely on us for their development. And they're just saying, well, to heck with you. And they're building coal stations like crazy all over the place.
Right.
China even more. Okay, they're building coal stations everywhere. Now, it's interesting, Paul. The United Nations, they don't treat countries equally when it comes to your commitments under the Paris Agreement. See, the Paris Agreement is based on something called the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which Brian Mulroney, a conservative, by the way, as he signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And what it says is that there's two classes of citizens, so to speak, when it comes to countries. Developing and developed countries. We're considered developed, of course, but China, even today, is considered a developing country. And according to the Framework Convention, and the Paris Agreement sits on it, so everything in the Framework Convention gives a foundation for the Paris Agreement, it says that the first and overriding priority of developing countries is poverty alleviation and development. It doesn't say greenhouse gas emissions. So what's going to happen is when 2030 rolls around, which is when China is supposed to cap its emissions. China right now is putting out twice as much CO2 emissions as the United States. It's by far the world's leader. Something like a third of the whole world of CO2 comes from China. But when it gets to 2030, they're going to sail right through it, even though the Paris Agreement says they're supposed to restrict their emissions and cap them at 2030. And people are going to say to them, what are you doing? You have a Paris Agreement obligation to cap your emissions. And China's going to say, and we already know because this has been brought up at some of the COP meetings, China's going to say, no, we have an out clause. Article 4 in the Framework Convention says that our first and overriding priority is development and poverty alleviation, and the cheapest way to do that is coal.
We often also hear media reports on severe weather, and again, blamed on climate change. So we're saying, okay, we're seeing increased earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, floods, droughts, you name it, right? Do we have stats on this one way or the other? Is climate change behind that? And is it actually reality that we're seeing, more severe weather situations?
No, we're not, actually. What's happening, and the reason the insurance claims are going through the roof, is because there's a lot more infrastructure. I used to work with Dr. Tad Murty, who is an expert in oceans and extreme weather and cyclones and all sorts of things. And he pointed out that in the last 100 years, he passed away just recently, unfortunately, but he pointed out that in the last 100 years, there's been a 13-fold increase in infrastructure across the world. So statistically speaking, if 100 years ago there was one hotel on a particular stretch of Florida's coastline, now there's 13. So when a storm hits, even though these buildings are much better built, they're much more robust. There's no question about that. They have better building standards. There's still going to be more claims adding up because there's more and more things to knock down, okay? But if you actually look at the statistics on hurricanes, for example, that's a good example. tropical cyclones, and that's what a hurricane is in the North Atlantic, and it's a typhoon in the Pacific. But tropical cyclones have not increased in either intensity or frequency. Okay, and even the UN admits this. And I'll just read you a quote from the UN, actually. I have it right here,
Okay.
concerning hurricanes. And the same thing with floods. Yeah, I'll just say one thing about floods because I have it right here. Even the Trudeau government's Environment and Climate Change Canada, here's what they said in their 2019 climate report. There do not appear to be detectable trends in short duration extreme precipitation in Canada for a country as a whole based on available station data. So they're saying there isn't any increase in intense rainfall. And it is interesting because the IPCC say point blank, there's low confidence in the emergence of drought frequency and observations for all types of droughts in all regions. And you could go through the whole list, but I will find you the hurricane one because it is quite interesting. Let's see, hurricanes. Well, here's tornadoes. Observation trends, and this is from the IPCC itself. Observation trends in tornadoes, hail, and lightning associated with severe convective storms are not robustly detected due to insufficient coverage of the long-term observations. So, and you see this all over the place.
So are we basically being lied to then? Is that what's happening? Or
yes, exactly. Because what's happening is you have the science report of the IPCC, and the science report does not support a lot of the pronouncements from the leaders of the IPCC report. In fact, this has led to some scientists actually resigning entirely in disgust from the IPCC. It's interesting. Some of these folks will hear Paul Ryder, for example, who's an expert in, mosquitoes and the malaria that's spread by mosquitoes. He was saying that he was watching a news report on his topic, his specialty. He's the expert from France. And they were saying something totally different to what he actually said. And so, of course, he left the IPCC. And you see, Paul, there's a massive corruption in the IPCC process. You would normally expect the summary for policymakers, which is the only thing, if anything, that the politicians read or the media read from the massive, they have an equivalent volume to this, our NIPCC. But I was one of the editors of this. That's why I'm promoting it. But regardless, that's at climatechangereconsidered.org. Within the science reports, there's a lot of honesty in the IPCC science reports, and they will say point blank, there is low confidence that certain things are true, like extreme storms or hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever. But what happens is when they write the summary for policymakers, that's written by politicians and representatives of politicians. And so they design the summary for policymakers, which gets all the publicity. They design it to reflect the kind of emergency they want to actually announce to the world. And here's the thing, which is totally ridiculous. Normally, you would expect if your boss came to you and said, "Oh, you're writing a big report. Could you give me the summary?" You'd say, "Well, I haven't finished writing the report yet. Let me finish the report and then I'll give you the summary." But your boss comes back and says, no, I have a press conference tomorrow. I want the summary now. You say, "Well, I can't write the summary because I haven't finished writing the report." They say, "We don't care." And so that's what happens in the IPCC process is they announce the release of the summary report. And according to IPCC regulations, you won't believe this, but according to IPCC regulations, the scientists are expected to go back and tune the science report to match the summary for policymakers, which was decided by politicians. So the process is totally corrupt. I mean, they should release them together. That would be ideal.
Well, something needs to change there. I mean, what bothers me probably more than anything else in this whole climate change debate, because I mean, again, I think there's a lot of people who genuinely believe, that our planet is in danger and that there is a climate emergency, so forth. So I want to be respectful to these people. But you know what? Our politicians, our university leaders say follow the science. But if a fellow scientist, a fellow politician, dares to actually ask questions about the whole debate, the current narrative, you get mocked, you get ridiculed, you get name called, you get put down, you get canceled. So, should it be unreasonable to ask questions on this? I think any person who has logic going through their brain, through their veins would say, of course it's okay to ask questions. We should teach our children, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to disagree without actually putting each other down and so forth. So something needs to change. Let me ask you this, I guess, because we're up against the clock here, but where do you see this going over the next decade, the whole debate on climate change and people actually daring to ask questions?
Well, I'll just tell you one thing real quick on the question issue. Why does Danielle Smith support the climate scare? What happened in 2012 when she was, head of the Wild Rose Party is she was at a CBC-sponsored event, the wrong place to start to question climate change. And she said, I'm not sure about this. We have to stay in touch with the science. And she said some very sensible things. And she was massacred. Okay, not only by the audience, which is heavily stacked left-wingers, but also by the media afterwards. And since then, she's just backed right off. So they actually try to scare, and they're very successful actually in scaring people. Tim Ball, who just passed away, he was our lead scientist. He had 5 very serious death threats. So a lot of people will run away when this sort of thing happens. But where is it going? I'll tell you where it's going. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, and that's unfortunate. So what's going to happen is 2 things. First of all, it's going to drive companies out of Canada because the regulations are insane. But secondly, we will start to see major power blackouts. In Alberta last winter, we came darn close. If Alberta hadn't been supported by Saskatchewan with coal.
I am out of time here, Tom. So we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for spending time with us here today. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Paul.
All right. Tom Harris. Tom is, again, the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. You can check out their website, icsc-canada.com. Thank you for watching today. Much appreciated. Again, you can watch or listen to the podcast on wiseup.ca or at returntoreason.com. God bless.